I'm here today with Professor Kathleen Stock, who is a professor of philosophy at Sussex University in England. And she just published a book called Material Girls, Why Reality Matters for Feminism, which I have right here on my Kindle. So if you see me looking down throughout the interview, I'm looking at my notes. And Professor Stock, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really honored to speak with you today about the book. And before we jump into it, I wanted to ask you just a bit about the context and the environment in which you published it. I know that the publishing industry is, tricky on this issue. I myself was kicked out of the industry for going against gender identity theory. And and you just tweeted that, despite the success of Material Girls, you won't be doing the Lit Festival circuit this year. So I was just wondering if you could start by telling us a bit about that environment.
Yeah, I mean, I only see it at a distance and I don't have much to compare it to. But it's my impression from talking to people in the publishing industry that it's quite unusual for a book that's doing this well in terms of sales. For instance, it was number 11 in hardback nonfiction in the UK, in books, full stop, in its first week. So that's significant, I think. And yet, apparently, I mean, I'm not getting the sort of invitations that you'd normally get on the back of those sorts of sales. But actually, since I tweeted that, my publicist has said, there's one literary festival that we're still talking to. So, I don't, who knows, maybe that'll happen. But obviously, it's a controversial topic and it's a relatively uncompromising book. And I think it just doesn't fit with a nice narrative of positive liberal feminism, the sort of narrative that we're used to, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. And what's been for you the reaction sort of among the people around you in your circles since the book came out?
Well, I mean, I was already amongst fellow philosophers, people had already made their minds up about me a long time ago, because I have been publishing articles and blog posts about this for 3 years. So it's not I don't think there's any kind of new reaction. The people that hated me before still hate me, and possibly hate me a bit more. And the people that like me still like me. So I really do try not to dwell on my critics. I don't go looking. People do bring stuff to my attention, but I'm a bit insulated, because I think it's important to just keep your eye on the main goal, which is to, in my case, to talk to the mainstream about this issue in a way that is as clear as possible. So that's what I've tried to do.
Yeah, while reading your book, things are so clearly and cleanly stated. I've already cited you a bit in some of my videos on my channel.
Excellent.
Yeah, and the appeal to the mainstream it definitely comes through. It's something that I think could be a primer for people who might not even know anything about the issue. It's also quite interesting if you do know about it, because you really parse things philosophically. And so one of the things that I wanted to start with is this question of, I've asked a lot of different people, do you think that people really believe in some of the tenets of gender identity theory, as you call it? I asked, do you think people really believe that a man can become a woman? And yeah, you address this in the book. So tell us, what do you think about that?
Well, I think some people believe it. I think it would be strange to dismiss everyone and say none of you can believe this. Clearly some do. And I think actually, as I say in the book, when it comes to younger people, they may well be taking it on authority from what they hear around them. So if a major activist organization says trans women are women, then they might just think, okay, well, that's that, why would they reject that? But I do think that quite a lot of people who say things like trans women are literally women, trans men are literally men, you can change sex, I don't think they believe it. I think, as I say in the book, they're immersed in a fiction, which they think they're engaged in for benevolent reasons. They think it's therapeutic. Well, originally anyway, this is certainly why I used to go along with it. I thought it was therapeutically beneficial for people in interpersonal contexts, like trans people, to have you go along with that. And I think trans people themselves, are, many of them are immersed in a fiction. And that's not the same thing as believing it as literally true, because as I say in the book, being immersed in a fiction is a very normal activity. Nearly all humans do it. You know, getting immersed in a drama or a novel or a film, it's very natural to us. But it doesn't mean that we believe that the things that are going on are real. It doesn't mean that we've completely lost touch with the reality, that we couldn't get out of the cinema if we had to, you know, or so we don't confuse fiction and reality, most of us. And so I think that I tried to introduce this concept because I am a philosopher of fiction, and I've spent quite a lot of my life working on that. And yet, it seems to me the concepts from that area just fit so nicely in this area. So I want to be clear that I don't think it's bad to immerse yourself in fictions. I think what's bad is for some people, it does cause them to lose touch with reality. And what's particularly bad is institutions trying to coerce us into doing it. And that's where I really have the strongest critique.
Yeah, and you talk about how in service of coercion, to be immersed in this fiction, there's a lot of moralizing. And that's kind of the tack they use to coerce people, where they say you're being mean or you're being hateful and you can't criticize trans people. And they sort of moralize. And how effective is that in making people immerse themselves in fiction?
Well, it's quite effective. Clearly, I think we can see it's effective because it makes people who don't know any better panic about the effects of stating reality as they understand it to be. They think they're going to do some terrible harm if they point out that this person is male or that person is female. So yes, but the moralizing aspect to transactivism actually fits with my hypothesis, because if people really believed it, they wouldn't get so upset about it. They would just explain the evidence for the view. But that's not what happens. You find, I mean, of course, there are some people who try and find arguments to show you that you can change sex, but most people don't have those arguments. They're just really keen to say, you shouldn't say that, you know, you shouldn't name reality. And if they lead with that, then I think that's a clue that the discourse is not about truth, and it never was. And they know it. On some level, they know it.
Yeah. And do you think that, I mean, maybe this is something we could get into more later, but do you think that this house of cards is starting to crumble? Are people, I mean, people have called your book a turning point, which I think could be very apt. And yeah, do you feel that things are starting to shift?
Well, I mean, it's a global picture, isn't it? And I don't have an overview. I mean, I hear that self-ID is coming in various European nations. So the target of the book is gender identity, and or at least gender identity ideology. I actually think there's nothing wrong with having a gender identity that is at odds with your sex, and I try and explain what that is. And like I say, it might be beneficial when you do have a gender identity at odds with your sex to immerse yourself temporarily or longer in a fiction that you are of the opposite sex. So I'm not trying to get rid of that as a possibility. I'm trying to alert the world to the fact it is a fiction, and it cannot be unacceptable to name sex reality in every context. Like, we need to name it in lots of contexts, like sport, sexual orientation, and so on. So is it all crumbling? I doubt it. Not yet. I mean, there's a way to go, I think. But I think certainly there's momentum gathering, partly because the effects of gender identity or ideology are getting more visible. Like, when you see male bodies in women's sport, you know what that is. You can't, people will see that, they will not like it. So I think the only reason it's got so far at the moment is because most people don't understand what's happening.
And the concept that you just mentioned of that you don't think there's anything wrong with someone who has a gender identity that doesn't align with their sex, that is really something that your book really stands out in the sense that you follow a principled path, and you don't necessarily, I think, plant your flag in any ideological camp. It's really quite refreshing. Is that accurate?
I try not to. I mean, obviously I will have some views that align with some ideologies, but it's true that I'm not just giving a radical feminist analysis, and as the radical feminists know, because they are quite angry with me on various aspects of this book, or some of them are. I'm trying to think it through for myself. It's what I've always done in philosophy. It's what I'm trained to do. And also, I think we do need to take the heat and toxicity out of the public confrontation, as it were. So any way we can dial it down a bit, whilst at the same time retaining the capacity to name what's there, is a good thing. So that's what I'm trying to do, steer that course between naming what's there when we need to name it, but not necessarily throwing in a ton of vitriol as well.
And you talk about how we do need words for someone whose gender identity doesn't align with their sex, right? Like, because you'll have some radical feminists who are gender critical feminists who will just, refuse to use the word trans woman, for example.
Yeah.
They'll just say man.
Yeah, I mean, it does follow from my view that trans women are men. Because they are adult human males, and we need a name for adult human males. That's the concept we have, and they fit it. But that's not, I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff in the book about how we're encouraged to see that as some kind of insult, but it's not. Yes, I see on the issue of whether we should use the word trans woman or use the word trans man, I do see how it is confusing to people who do not understand what it means. And I do see how it can lead to confusion. But there's lots of words in the English language and in every other language that lead to confusion if you don't know what they mean. Like seahorses are not horses, slow worms are not worms. There's a lot of etymologically words are messy. And I think that's, as long as we all understand what it means to be a trans woman or a trans man, then I think we can use the word. I think the confusion gets in when people think that you've literally changed sex, or you are just a woman now, like any other kind of woman, because unfortunately you're not.
Yeah, this is something that I've talked about with other people, with radical feminists, and I've struggled to articulate my position on this, in that I do use preferred pronouns like most of the time. And you also do that in your book, and you explain exactly what you just mentioned, that we don't always use language exactly literally. Sometimes we do engage with fictions, and that's okay. It's not always like you're lying or you're deceiving yourself or you're engaging in this horrible conspiracy.
Yeah. I mean, I do think trans activism has pushed a false dilemma onto us. They've said either it's literally true, or you think we're lying, or you think we're deceiving you. Evil, the trope of evil deceivers is made a lot of in philosophy. And there is a third way. I mean, we don't say of actors at the cinema or on stage when we're really engaged in a fiction with them that they are deceiving us. We might talk loosely like that, but we don't mean it. There's nothing sinister about it. We're very familiar with the process of play. And we need a bit more play, perversely, in this whole thing. And equally, radical feminists saying, no, everything has to be absolutely literal at all times for clear communication. That's not how things work either. So there are times when I use preferred pronouns in most cases interpersonally, like where somebody might hear me or it might make a difference. However, in the last week, I've deliberately not used them in 2 cases out loud in public. One of them was on a podcast where I was talking about Karen White, who is a male rapist and paedophile convicted, who was in a female prison in the UK. I'm not going to call Karen White she. He's a he. So it's a courtesy, and I can withdraw the courtesy. And the other case I wouldn't use it is when I was looking at and talking about a video involving a 9-year-old boy who is being raised by his parents as a trans girl. And I don't think it helps any 9-year-olds to use preferred pronouns. So that's my personal decision. Obviously, other people have different decisions, but the whole language around pronouns has become so oppressive that even saying that out loud seems radical. But as far as I've given the defense of it in the book, it's not radical. Pronouns have tracked sex for the whole of the English language, pretty much, except in playful contexts.
Right. And speaking of children, so what does it do to a young child's brain when we tell them, for you give an example in the book that you don't really have the answer what it does, but if you tell a child, if you point to a trans woman and say that's a woman, it
Yeah,
confuses them.
I think it definitely confuses them because, as I say, I looked into some stuff from cognitive science on how we acquire what you might call perceptual concepts or visual concepts, like, the kid typically walking around and the parent will say, that's a tree, that's a dog, that's a cat. And if you the first dog they see might be a bulldog, the next dog they might see might be a dachshund, and the next one a whippet. They're all very different shapes, but somehow, amazingly, the brain develops this capacity to get the prototype, as it were, and then pick out new ones without being told. It's an amazing capacity of the brain. And it's the same with sex. We introduce the child to all sorts of different females, and then they develop the capacity to identify females based on kind of pretty generic features of female appearance. At the moment, we're pointing to obviously male looking people and saying that's a woman, and then a female people and saying that's a woman. I literally don't know what it's doing, actually, to children, very young children who are developing recognitional concepts. I assume that they end up with the sort of inference that there's two kinds of women. And maybe they then get the sense that they're not allowed to mention that, but they must know that there's two different kinds of things, because our brain just has this capacity to see it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's so weird about criminalizing or trying to criminalize statements of fact about sex, because children and people on the autistic spectrum, for instance, are very likely to just say what they see, and they're not wrong. It's just considered hateful to say it, but it's the truth.
Mm-hmm. It's making me think of this concept in literature of estrangement. I remember when I studied War and Peace in college, and we learned about this concept of estrangement in this scene in War and Peace at the opera, where the character sees everything as false. Like, she doesn't see them as the characters they're playing. She sees a woman in a cheap dress, and she sees a cardboard box instead of the set. And it's this like shocking experience. But with the children, where you're talking about how we're teaching children something, we're immersing them in an adult fiction. It just makes me think about that concept. Kind of, do they see it? Do they feel a dissonance? I mean, adults certainly feel dissonance around this.
I don't know what they feel. I mean, I remember one of the sort of pivotal moments on my path to starting to speak out was being on Facebook and seeing some academic I know, or used to know, saying, talking proudly about the way his daughter had come home age 4 and said, men can have women can have penises too, and he was presenting this as something he was very proud of his daughter for saying. And I was thinking, what's going on with that daughter, now, like in her conceptual categories of the world? Because it doesn't matter if we eliminated our capacity to refer to the difference between males and females tomorrow, it wouldn't stop there being a difference, and it wouldn't stop that difference having all these social impacts in the world. I mean, it might reduce some of them because of their linguistics, but yeah, we still need words to refer to that difference, and we need to teach children the difference, quite obviously. I mean, especially girls.
Yeah, and something that, I mean, much has been made of in the opposition to gender identity ideology is the impact on lesbians, and young lesbians in particular. And I wonder if you hear from them. And I mean, because when you describe this, that this father is proud of his daughter for saying that women can have penises, it's like, what is that doing to young lesbians? We are hearing from them that it's not good. Do you converse with them? Like, do they reach out to you?
I get emails from a wide range of people, and I've had the occasional one from younger lesbians, but I usually get them from older lesbians who are really worried about what's happening. I mean, I do think if you are in a young queer community, for a start, you're very unlikely to identify yourself as a lesbian. It's like not a word that's particularly cool. And when you're figuring out your sexuality, And there's this huge pressure socially within your community, in inverted commas, to treat trans women as lesbians as well, then yes, that's going to have a big impact on you, especially if you're remotely susceptible to moral pressure, which a lot of girls are. You want to do the right thing. I mean, a lot of heterosexual girls will end up sleeping with men through moral pressure. So there's no reason why lesbians wouldn't either, especially if they're not really sure they're lesbian or they're just trying to figure that out. So again, we need words to be able to defend same-sex orientation from encroachments from the heterosexual world, and trans women who are attracted to females are heterosexual males. And we need to be able to say that. It's just true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or bisexual, but they're not
right.
lesbians.
Right. Yeah. What do you think of the origins of queer theory coming partially from feminism? So you talk about this a little bit, and I'm really curious about this because I personally, on my arc, have decided that I don't want to be a feminist anymore. I don't want to be a part of this ideology.
I didn't know that.
And so I've gotten some flack for that. But
I bet.
Yeah, and reading your book, it was really interesting to me because I can see that you're kind of observing things from this position above, where you're surveying the landscape and you call out feminists and certain aspects of feminism, both second wave and third wave, radical feminism, liberal feminism. Maybe we could start with talking about the concept of women as a social role and where that came from, what that means.
Absolutely. So the definition, or at least the account of womanhood that I was most familiar with before gender identity, that was, womanhood is a social role. And that's quite strangely popular. I think I just accepted it, so if you have a certain kind of social presentation, usually presumably thinking of trans women, that passing trans women who are indiscernible from females, that's what being a woman is. And that's quite an accommodating, supposedly accommodating position, although it very quickly leads to the question, but what's a feminine social role? Do I have it? Or, so there's lots of questions there. But that originally, I think, came out of late 20th century feminism, and the idea that we could escape this specter of what's called biological determinism. The biological determinism being the view coming from anti-feminists, or just men, or some women, traditionalists, that a whole set of domestic characteristics are built into female biology. So if you're a woman, then you should be, it's natural for you to have children and to stay at home and look after them and not to go into the education or the workplace. So that's biological determinism. And some feminists thought that it would be a genius idea to redefine womanhood so that we weren't defined in terms of our biology anymore, and then we'd escape this threat of biological determinism. It's absolutely mad philosophical. You've just changed the subject, basically.
And is that Simone de Beauvoir?
Well, no, because Simone de Beauvoir didn't mean that, but she gets recuperated into this narrative that womanhood is really social, and you can you develop into a woman through a certain kind of social education. It's nonsense. And it didn't see off the threat of biological determinism, because strangely enough, the anti-feminists weren't reading feminist texts. This is what I always find so kind of like amazingly hubristic about some feminists. They just want to change the language so that a word that has been in our language for millennia now refers to something different. Well, if you're going to do that, you better have a public campaign. And I suppose in a way that's what we're seeing now. But that move then opened up a space for males to say they're women, basically, if they have the right social presentation, or for feminists to say that some males are women because they have the right social presentation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another aspect that you kind of call out feminism for, that I thought was really a good point. You said the concept of privilege is also weaponized by all sides, used not so much as a serious tool of analysis, but as a playground insult, and often producing the amusing spectacle of one group of people castigating another group of identical background, education, and financial means for their privilege. Meanwhile, transphobe and misogynist are chucked about liberally.
Well, they are, aren't they? I mean, it doesn't help that a lot of this takes place on social media with a limited word character count. So it's just much easier to go, transphobe, homophobe, rather than actually have an argument. But that first comment about privilege being chucked about, I mean, that was somewhat barbed. I mean, there's people in my own institution, academics of exactly the same, I would say, class as me. They're white, they're university educated, they're at the same level of seniority. They're actually, a lot of them, straight as well. I mean, at least I'm gay. But anyway, at least I've got that. But and they're shouting at me saying, white middle class cis privilege. And I'm like, well, and you, It's just silly. It's like playground insults. And a lot of this is about trying to get somebody to shut up through insulting them. A lot of trans activism proceeds that way. So I've had enough of it.
Yeah. And this is one of the things that I've noticed that has made me also want to, as much as and to be clear, when I say I'm not a feminist anymore, it doesn't mean that I've shifted away from my interest in promoting women's rights.
Yeah.
But I am now much more hesitant to align myself with an ideology, because I did start to see some certain similarities in the ideology. I mean, for one thing, that they get mad at you for saying you're not a part of it. That's something right there.
Well, some do, not all.
No, yeah.
I mean, I have lively discussions with some of my radical feminist friends about this, with whom I'm still friends. I used to think that, look, feminism, arguing about what feminism is a bit like arguing what the left is. As long as you think I'm focused on women, then you're a feminist, and you're interested, you're focused on the interests of women politically, then you're a feminist. And that's a very broad spectrum. I mean, that's why the book is called Why Reality Matters for Feminism, because I am a feminist in that sense. But there's lots of things about radical feminism and liberal feminism that I disagree with. I actually want to write another book and actually spell out what those are. And so my friends say, well, then you're not a feminist. If you don't sign up for our version, then you're not a feminist. So then maybe we just need another word for what we are, womanist or something, except that's taken too. We need a new word maybe, but the point is we are female focused and we're interested in the political interests of women. And I think that's a good starting point.
Right. Yeah, you have a great part in here where you say, rather than actually arguing about substantive points, energy is strategically diverted into arguments between feminist factions as to who are the true keepers of the feminist flame, mirroring a dynamic within other political movements, who's really on the left or the right, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously going to annoy some people. There is this concept of the narcissism of small differences. I don't know if you've read about it, but it's a bit like that scene in Monty Python where the People's Front of Judea are arguing with the Judean People's Front or something.
Okay.
Now, I'm not saying that that's what's going on in feminism all the time, but we should be careful. Also, we should just be able to handle disagreement a bit better. I really do think. Like you say, there are some people that really just say, you're dead to me as soon as if you disagree with Sheila Jeffreys, you're dead to me. That's ridiculous. I mean, for a start, the world we live in is changing radically. It's not the world we had in the 70s and 80s. We need to respond to the new challenges it's bringing us. We need new voices. We need not to deter them by our toxic defensiveness. I think, anyway.
Yeah. Well, then there's also this concept that within, a lot of different strains of feminism, that it may be all, I'm not sure, that women have, that because of women's status as part of an oppressed class, our voice has more importance than men's voices in the conversation, which to me echoed something that I see in like critical race theory or other what we call woke, quote unquote, woke ideology, where your identity, your group-based identity becomes more important than other factors, like even factors of, you know, socioeconomic status or other ways that we might politically analyze people's lives.
I think I'm not sure I completely agree with you about that. I think we need a nuanced position on the role of experience in this discussion, and in discussion of race as well, no doubt. Any discussion where it's group identity that's being discussed. So I think there really is a sense in which a lot of males have no idea what we're talking about. They clearly haven't thought about, for instance, the impact of self-ID on women. Equally, there's a way in which middle-class people like me don't necessarily know. I mean, middle class, I'm using this in the English sense of like, I don't know what the equivalent in America is, because I'm told you don't have this distinction between working class and middle class.
We do a bit, but yeah, mostly people don't use that.
I mean, I'm university educated,
Yeah.
and kind of like relatively, I would afraid to use the word privileged, certainly economically. So I don't know necessarily what it's like for someone who isn't in that position financially, is much more precarious. So there's lots of ways in which we should listen hard to a range of voices, and particularly maybe check for our own biases when we're doing so. I don't see there's anything wrong with that. But of course, that doesn't mean that we should just pick a random person as representative of a group and say, I completely outsource my brain to you now, and whatever you say, you stand for your community, because that's rubbish. And also it's insulting. So people do this all the time for trans activism. They'll just find a trans person that says the right thing and then say, well, the trans community has spoken, as if trans people were a hive mind. You know, I mean, it's absolutely insulting. Of course, they're going to differ in their understandings of themselves, their politics, and all sorts of things. So we need much more consultation and more democracy, I think, especially when it comes to policy changes. But on the other hand, I'm not going to rule out that sometimes I think we should listen harder to particular kinds of voices in particular conversations, because I think we should.
Mm-hmm. You reminded me of when I got fired. Actually, my boss
yeah.
told me that the reason, you know, my tweets were offensive was because that's, quote, not how trans people see it. And
right.
I told him, you know, I don't think trans people are not a monolith.
Mm-hmm.
And I told him I follow trans people who actually don't see it that way.
Yeah, it's actually, I don't like using the word transphobic, but I really do find the kind of infantilization of trans people by trans activists who are not trans as extremely suspect. In my experience, people on my side of the fence, like our, you know, gender critical people, are much more likely to recognize that there is a range of opinions on this issue than people who are very pro self-ID. At that point, they just say, you know, I've had people say to me, like a Guardian journalist said to me once, do you even know any trans people? So I was like, yes, I do. Because the three she's met all say the same. Therefore, you know, it's just ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. And because she's immersed in this fiction, she thinks, you know, if someone's speaking outside of the fiction, that's automatically transphobic.
Well, yes, that probably too. I mean, I don't know what she actually thought, but it was just something about the way she asked me. Mm-hmm. It just revealed a whole lot about her presuppositions.
Right. She just assumes that you won't have considered their perspective.
Yeah, I just turned up and I'm like, okay, I'm just going to make this shit up now.
Right.
I mean, I do that, but
yeah. Have you gotten that reaction in general? I mean, do people fail to see kind of how meticulous you've been philosophically going through everything?
Yeah, of course. Well, I've got a very dedicated group of detractors, some in philosophy, some in other areas, and it's not in their interest to read this book neutrally. So they are, if they're reading it at all, they're just picking out the weakest points, the things they can think they can criticize me for. But most of the smearing I get, along with everybody else, are really terrible arguments from analogy, like, you know, single sex spaces where women can get undressed and sleep, you know, without male intrusion is like segregation. a racial segregation, or it's like anti-Semitism, or it's like, you know, it's like, and you never really get a chance to say, hang on it, okay, let's start from the beginning there. Give me this in 10 steps. How is it like that? You know, what are the relevant differences? Have we considered them? You know, it's just really childish. And I used to think it was deliberately childish. Now I think my critics are kind of stupid. That's my new assumption.
Yeah, it's not a bad assumption from where I stand too. But so okay, how do you respond to that one, the segregation one? Because we're also getting it a lot here in the US, because we have there is an attempt to redefine sex in law as gender in federal law, and we're seeing the prison issue is kind of exploding now here in the US, where male convicted rapists are being transferred to female prisons. So, and then people call it segregation. They compare it to segregation. How do you respond to that one?
Well, I respond by saying, in order to say X is like Y, you have to look at the whole phenomenon. You can't just take one tiny aspect of it, the fact that two groups of people are separated and that maybe some of them don't want to be separated, as kind of emblematic of the whole. You have to look into the reasons why they're separated and what would happen if they weren't separated, and etc. So you have to have a proper look. Now, obviously, the reasons why women are separated from males in prisons is because men are much bigger and stronger and have a sexual interest, a lot of them, in women, and particularly in prisons where there's a lot of people with personality disorders and low inhibitions, and you know, it's completely unfair to put women who are on average not violent offenders when they're in prison. They're not there for the same sorts of offenses, at least not in Britain. I assume it's the same in the States. You know, you are literally putting a kind of potentially very dangerous person in a place they should not be. There's nothing like that going on at the racial segregation. And if anything, it's the white people who are more dangerous for the black people. So, you know, the whole thing is upside down. Racial segregation came from a completely different set of motivations to the sex separation question. Quite obviously, the motivations are different. They're abhorrent in the case of racial segregation, and they're not abhorrent. In fact, it's abhorrent not to separate in the case of males and females where women are sexually vulnerable. So the question is, to these people making these facile analogies, assuming they're not completely stupid, is, do you care about women? Because you don't seem to care about women, that you're willing to bring in these absolutely spurious analogies in order to motivate male sex offenders' contact with females who never had much of a chance in life anyway. Sorry, I know I'm sort of shouting at you, but I really get cross with these stupid arguments made by people in universities mostly, who will never have to face the consequences of their idiotic arguments.
Exactly. I mean, if you look at someone like Chase Strangio, lawyer at the ACLU, trans man, and you know, Chase is saying that something like there's been a manufactured hysteria around the safety of women in prisons. I don't know if that was the exact wording. I'm not sure if the word hysteria was used, but it was something like that. And it's so deeply offensive, because Chase will never be in that situation, most likely will never be in prison and experience this.
And in England, we've had Karen White, the male trans woman that I was talking about earlier, assaulting female inmates. You know, it's not rocket science to work this out. Nothing about human nature changes when a male puts on a dress. You know, if they were a good person before, they'll be a good person afterwards. If they were not a good person before, they will still not be a good person afterwards. And I think that the culture at the moment, especially in the States, actually seems to have this sort of magical, the progressive culture, kind of magical vision of what happens to someone when they transition, that it's this whole new redemption narrative, you know, as if they've completely changed, and they probably haven't. So, you know.
Yeah, that's an interesting. Oh, that's okay. You could finish your point.
Well, I just want to be clear, because this is so subject to distortion, that when we talk about these cases, there is no inference that all trans people are or all trans women are sexual predators at all. We're talking about patterns of male violence across populations. Trans women are male, some of them will show these patterns. And when we exclude males from female spaces, it's not a character reference for all males. You know, most men will not sexually offend, I think. Most trans women won't sexually offend, but it's about keeping vulnerable women safe from the few. Okay, so I just wanted to clarify that.
Right. You say in the book that these protective measures, by definition, have to be broad brush.
Yeah, so. Yeah, because we can't go, you know, when you're talking about who gets into the changing room or who, I mean, in the prison, it's slightly easier because there'll be some kind of board. But when you're talking about changing rooms and public spaces, there's absolutely no other way to do it. We just have to do it in terms of saying this kind of person goes here and this kind of person goes here. And it's roughly appearance-based so that you can say, sorry, I don't think you belong here to a man.
Right, because you have to be able to perceive things and name them. And then you mentioned that sort of obsession about the transformation, the idea that it's transforming more than what it's really transforming. And you talk about how young people, kids who want to transition, they almost feel like, I don't know if I'm getting this quite right, but they feel like it's part of their personal hero's journey, and that it's kind of something that makes them special. And maybe that's why they shape their identity around it.
I think that's true of some kids. I mean, I don't generalize. I try not to generalize about a whole population, but I do think with kids especially, and teenagers who are spending a lot of time online, and with the rise of the smartphone, it's easy. We're encouraged, in fact, and they're encouraged to curate your identity. The word is curate, as if, you know, you deliberately choose how you present yourself, and it through the internet. So it's very easy then to choose a persona that's attractive to you, or that says what you want it to say to the world, without it, and to immerse yourself in the fiction that is you now. So yeah, I guess there's an element of hero's journey in that, perhaps. Certainly it's going to make you seem cooler to your friends, or that's going to have a relatively short shelf life. I can't see how it's going to be indefinitely going to make you seem cooler, but for now it makes you seem cooler. And maybe if you had trouble making friends in the first place, it might help, you know, because it gives you a whole new kind of story to tell about yourself. So all of those things are just normal parts of being a teenager as well. You know, it's just that the culture's handing teenagers new ways to do this.
Right. And as for the social contagion theory, I wonder if you think that also plays into the shelf life of the coolness of this, because usually these social contagions for teenage girls do seem to just kind of pass out of style. I mean, there was anorexia, self-harm, and these things shifted as the generations grew up. But now we have this whole infrastructure around teenagers transitioning. Do you think it will shift generationally naturally?
That's a really good question. I mean, you're right that, I mean, of course, there are still anorexic girls, but the trend aspect of it for some isn't there anymore. And the same with self-harm. Like I said this a few times now in interviews, but there was a time when I was teaching where girls would come in and they'd have cuts all over their arms, quite a lot of them. And I don't see that anymore. I think some of them still doing it, but there's the trend aspect's gone. But you're right that no one was ever putting an infrastructure in place in schools and universities which affirmed children in their anorexia or their cutting. And that is a really disturbing aspect of this, which goes back to the institutional compulsion that I was talking about, that, you know, you're compelled to go along with this fiction. Having said that, you know, teenagers don't really like being told what to do they? So maybe this will hasten the demise of the trend once your teachers are telling you. I just don't know, but there will be casualties. That's the thing. Even if it disappears or at least reduces this trend, there will still be casualties, because some children and teenagers have changed their bodies irrevocably on the basis of their self-understanding at the moment, but that self-understanding might change, and for many it will.
Yeah, and we're starting to hear their stories now, as much as the certain activists want to repress them. But okay, to shift a little bit, I wonder if I could ask you sort of a funny question, but what would you say to Judith Butler if she was here right now?
I would say, write clearly, Judith.
Yeah.
So your sentences are whack.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I don't know. She wouldn't want to talk to me. I think I would say I would try and bring her attention to the consequences of the coolness of her view and how it has sort of rippled out into popular culture. Not just her, there's a few others, but she's the big one. I saw an interview with her not that long ago where I just felt like she doesn't even know what's going on, partly because the left media is not reporting responsibly, so I don't blame her. If she only reads the New York Times, then she's not going to know. But I would just try and ask her how she feels about a lot of this. A lot of what's happening is really at odds with what she thinks, I think. She thinks of gender as a performance, as something fluid, everything socially constructed. Transactivism quite often ends up essentializing gender and making it absolutely your defining feature. I would want to ask her about that tension, and do you think it's good that women are removing their breasts based on a understanding of themselves as essentially male? Would you have any criticism of that culturally? And I'd be pleased if she would stick to her principles enough to actually say, no, that's not what I meant.
Right. So it's this concept that, so she would promote this concept that everything is socially constructed. So is that blank slate sort of constructivism?
Oh, it's beyond blank slate. I mean, she thinks biology is socially constructed. So it's not just that our bodies and brains are male and female, and after that everything's up for grabs. It's like there's no real natural fact about maleness and femaleness. It's all linguistically constructed, so constructed through language. I'm not attracted to it as a philosophical worldview. I think doesn't really make sense. It's just too totalizing and too simple, really. But yeah, she's beyond the blank slate.
Mm-hmm. And is there a contradiction? Is there an internal contradiction in gender identity ideology where they have some people seem to say that sex is a social construct, like what you're describing, this completely linguistic based reality, or not reality at all, maybe. And but then there's the concept that you have to transition the physical. So like you said, a woman who cuts off her breast because she thinks she's essentially male. Is that a contradiction there? Is that a tension between those things?
Well, there's a way in which the Butlerites or the first group could explain the second. They could say it's just a kind of elaborate performance. It's a bodily performance. It's queering the natural body. They could say that, but that's not why a lot of these kids and adolescents and people are doing it. It doesn't speak to their motives. What's in tension is that narrative that everything's play and performance and there's nothing essential, with this other narrative, which I talk about in the book quite a lot, the idea that your gender identity is innate, it's bursting through you, like coming out. And when it does come out, that's who you really are. It's your authentic self. It's something like, like someone bursting out of a cake. I'm here and now, no one can deny it. You cannot raise questions about it. You have to affirm it. At the same time, you're told no one else can know it except you. It's like, it's this really strange metaphysical thing that you're supposed to have inside of you. That makes no sense either. I mean, in a sense, if I had to pick one of those two views, I'd pick Butler.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah,
but I don't want either of them. Right. I don't want either of them.
Hopefully you won't be forced to choose. No. Yeah, you have the stick of rock candy analogy.
Yeah, that's the one. As if your gender identity is kind of written through you like a stick of rock candy. It's not. It's something that, it's a narrative that you develop about yourself over time, given your interpretation of the world and your place in it. It can you can settle on a narrative that really suits you, or you can go through different narratives throughout your life. None of that is innate or hardwired or determined by your brain or really in you in a sort of essential, authentic way. So all this rhetoric around, I finally discovered who I really was, it's at most metaphorically. You're not really discovering a fact inside yourself. Again, we're not explaining this to children very well at all. In fact, one of the things that I was kind of disturbed by as I was writing this book was I was having to read all these books written for children called things like Your Gender Identity and You, or being the authentic you. It was all the rhetoric around it. I can't remember exactly the titles, but there's an industry out there churning out books for young people based on the idea of your essential inner gender identity. And that's disturbing.
Yeah, it is. And you talk about how there's this resurgence of traditional gender roles almost from the same camp, where you describe this one writer, I don't remember exactly what this was from, but who said that they basically equated being a top and being a bottom with being male and female. Being a boy is a top, meaning dominant and submissive in sex. So that's just like, you cannot get any more traditional gender roles. It's so simplistic.
If that's taken literally, which it seemed to be, then yes, obviously it's incredibly regressive. It's woman as passivity, submission, bottom, man as masculinity, activity, top. And yeah, I mean, I think as soon as you start saying trans women are women, if you're trying to kind of literally, rationally motivate that, as opposed to just go along with a fiction, then all you've got to appeal to is things like, well, so why is this trans woman a woman? Well, they like feminine things, they feel like a woman. Well, what's a woman feel like? And you end up, obviously this point has been made very well by radical feminists, you end up with a regressive set of stereotypes about passivity and liking pink things and liking glittery things, and looking kind of relatively weak or small bodied. So yeah, it's really regressive.
Yeah, that was literally the thing that originally tipped me off to the problem here, peak transed me, as people call it, because I saw the prominent trans activists were embodying so many stereotypes about women, and they just looked like these Barbie dolls. And that was what really struck me, because I was trying to think of them as women. And you also describe this in the book, when the brain is seeing a man and trying to make yourself think that you're looking at a woman. And that's what I was trying to do when I started university and I was learning this. I wanted to be a good ally. And my brain couldn't do it. I couldn't see them as women because I saw them as a collection of these stereotypes, the stilettos, the like fake boobs, the tight dresses, tons of makeup, and all those elements. And you talk about how that objectification is really rearing its ugly head right now.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the biggest, hyperbolic, but one of the biggest challenges women face, and men actually, young men, is negotiating a culture of objectification of women that we have. And it's just getting worse through the internet, through visual culture, through pornography, which is consumed in an epic scale, and the kinds of pornography consumed, but also in terms of like music videos and magazines and adverts. It's just so objectifying of the female body. And I've been writing about objectification for way before I was writing about this issue, but I can absolutely see the connection, because it encourages us to all think that womanhood is a costume. It was just a really sexualized way of being. And I think it's at the root of many hang-ups that women have sexually about themselves. and maybe, you know, the predilection of many women for BDSM in a passive position, but it also is responsible for autogynephilia, which is a sexual fetish that males have where they fantasize about themselves as wearing women's clothes or having women's body, or other aspects of what they consider to be the female experience. But it's messing us up. You know, we need a better way to represent women generally, for the sake of our children, for the sake of our sexualities, you know, for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah. Well, to start to wrap up, besides that, which we said we need a new way of looking at or talking about women and womanhood, where do you think the conversation should go now? What should people focus on, and maybe what should they leave behind? What should we be talking about moving forward?
Well, we should be talking more about the serious problems faced by women across the world, I think, and particularly focusing on, you know, in terms of harm. The trouble with the language of oppression and harm is that, especially as wielded by university types, is that everything gets kind of flattened out. You know, prostitution is a harm for women across the world. And just because the odd, you know, moneyed university graduate enjoys it and has control over her work doesn't mean it's not a harm for 99% of women working in prostitution. So, you know, that is a problem. Then there's also FGM. There's also so-called honor killings. There's forced underage marriage. There's just global issues that we should be talking about. There's rape used as a weapon of war. We may not, I mean, the solutions are going to be complex, but it's just decadent that feminism has ended up talking about, you know, whether we should be able to wear lipstick at work or not. You know, it's just not where I think the moral purpose lies or should lie. So also we should develop better language to talk to younger women, because they face, you know, I've got students to do OnlyFans. I've got students age 20 that have injected Botox into their face. You know, it's a brutal culture out there for them. So I think we need to be able to bring them into the conversation too, in a way that they can deal with, and like not talk down to them or alienate them. This whole gender identity debate can turn into a older women versus younger women thing quite quickly. You know, particularly the sort of scathingness that people on my side tend to have for non-binary females. You know, there's a real kind of like, oh, you're ridiculous, you know, but they're not ridiculous. They're just trying to make sense of the world given the tools that they're being given. So we need to improve the tools, I think, and improve the conversation as well.
Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Kathleen Stock. To everyone listening, if you haven't yet bought Material Girls, go out and buy it and read it. Yes, perfect. Here it is.
Oh, could I say it's going to be on sale in hardback in the States and Canada from September the 21st.
Excellent. So, but you can get it now on Kindle, so you can still read it. All right. Well, thank you so much. This was really fun.
Thank you so much.